right, we got your email about Veterans Day,
Oh, good.
and we're going to see you. We're coming in tomorrow.
All right. Welcome, everybody.
Saturday,
Online.
Saturday.
I will start with that. Anybody who's a veteran, we have our veteran service this upcoming Saturday. Welcome to everybody who's in our study session. I am sorry we are late. I was on the wrong Zoom link and I didn't realize it for about 15 minutes. I was just sitting there waiting and nobody showed up, but I realized I was the one who didn't show up.
They see that.
So we're starting 10 minutes late. I apologize. Hopefully people will be able to see this later. And we have a great topic today, obviously, but welcome first to Larry and Flossie, Arlene, and Ron, and anybody who was here, but I wasn't here. I apologize again. I look forward, though, because we have some really cool stuff coming up, including our first live in-person session in a while, coming up in just a couple of weeks. Thank you, Larry, so much for organizing it. Here comes Arnold. We'll see if he can get in. So that is going to be coming up in November. So really excited about that. And that's November 30th. So right after Thanksgiving. And then we'll hopefully have a December 14th Hanukkah party if we can find somebody to host it or do it at the library again. Here's Arnold. Hopefully Arnold can make it in. What we're talking about today, of course, is a continuation of the Jewish Messiah discussion. And we talked about Napoleon, who is the most recent incarnation of what we call the Jewish Messiah, although we will talk about Schneerson at some point as well. That'll be probably something we should do, who is, of course, the founder of what we call the Chabad movement. That might be something for next week. But today, we're going to talk about Bar Kokhba, who's the Messiah with probably the most dire ramifications for the Jewish world, whereas Napoleon is considered the Messiah and did a lot to help Jews. Cyrus, we haven't talked about, we're going to do that later. And when we come to Bluffton, helped the Jews return to Israel. We talked about Shabtai Zvi, who converted to Judaism. The ramifications of his conversion was more of a depression in the Jewish world. The most dire results of any messianic character we'll find is in Bar Kokhba. And we're going to talk about the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is the revolt in what is today Israel that has the most ramifications. Has anybody ever seen pictures of Israel from the 19th century? Mark Twain famously went to Israel as a reporter and talked about how disgusting it was. So if you went to Israel, you went to Jerusalem, the only livable place in Jerusalem was in the old city. So this little small area, and it was disgusting with trash everywhere. The whole country of Israel in the 19th century was basically one of two things: swamp or desert. There was nothing going on there. There was no major cities. Jaffa was a port, obviously, or Jaffa, but there was nothing going on. There were no trees in the country. It was swampland and desert with small alcoves of people. It was a nothing province for 2,000 years until the modern state of Israel. Now, of course, Israel is beautiful. There's lots of trees everywhere. But the reason Israel became a swamp and a desert is not just because of attrition of 1,000 or 2,000 years. It's because of the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt. We're going to talk about how the Romans were not very happy about this revolt and basically killed everybody and burned the country down. And so the ramifications of that revolt were felt all the way into the 20th century, as Israel was just not a nice place to live for a variety of the reasons. But before we get to Bar Kokhba, we have to make sure people understand what is going on that caused the Bar Kokhba revolution, or the revolt, however you call it. So what years are we talking? We're talking about the 1st and 2nd century CE. So the year, basically, 1900 years ago. As we know, this was not the first war against the Romans. This was not the second war against the Romans. This was the third of the wars they called the Jewish-Roman Wars, although it really should be called the Roman-Jewish Wars because we didn't win any of them. What's worse is, ironically in many ways, the Jews during these three wars were excellent fighters and very good tacticians. That is bad. Why is it bad to be good at war and good tacticians? Because if you lose the war, the winning side is going to be that much more upset. If they beat you quickly and don't take up a lot of money and resources and time and don't lose a lot of men, it's not such a big deal. But if they have to slog through a long war and bring in more troops, and there are generals who are embarrassed, and there's people who are dead, and you have to take a lot of money out of the coffers, and you may want to go do a war against somebody really important like the Parthians, or you may want to go back to Rome and have your parade, but you don't want to spend years and years and years putting down a rebellion. You don't want to put down a rebellion in which they've taken a lot of Roman towns and killed a lot of soldiers, taken forts, because it takes forever. And that is exactly what happened in all three wars. All three wars, the Jews turned out to be incredibly gifted fighters. They just didn't have the numbers. They also didn't have the resources. So each of the three wars was devastating, the last one the most. So the first war, of course, is the war starting in 66. And this is the war that would end up with the destruction of the first temple. So religiously, this had the most impact because the temple's destroyed and the rabbis are going to take over. That's a pretty famous war. That's probably the most famous of them. The temple's destroyed in 70. We know about the people of Masada in 72, 73. The Dead Sea Scrolls, probably a result of that war. So that war is the most famous of the three. The second war is the least famous. This is the Kitos War. And this is a war that happens from 115 to 117. So think about that. There's been dissent and issues between Jews and Rome for a very long time. They had the first war in 66. The second war doesn't come for 50 years. So 50 years later, they have another war, which just shows the issues. The issues, of course, were taxation. The issues were idolatry. The issues were persecution. So in 115 through 117, the Romans were fighting the Parthian War. So the Parthians, of course, are in the east, Mesopotamia, and farther out, what is today Iran, I believe. So they're fighting this big war against a major enemy, which is the Parthians, who they have kind of quelled through the years. And so while they're fighting this war, the Jews in various cities take the opportunity to rebel. And Cyprus and Egypt and Cyrenaica. And so they rebel in these places, and it's a major rebellion that takes 2 years because now they have to come back from this, Trajan has to come back from this war, and they have to go and defeat the Jews in these three areas, and then they have to go all the way to what's Lod today in Israel, and go there and capture the leaders of the rebellion and make sure they're killed. And so it takes them several years, plus they have to leave another war to come for this war. And it's mostly because of taxation, because of the Roman garrisons were not treating Jews very well. And the numbers are incredible. I mean, if you believe the actual numbers of people killed, it's astonishing. And no wonder the Romans were upset, because there are records, whether they're true or not, that the Jews were especially brutal. This may have been, of course, propaganda afterwards, but that there were thousands and thousands and thousands of Roman citizens and military personnel who were killed in these various areas. Thousands upon thousands. And so it's no wonder that they forcibly put this rebellion down 3 years later. So it's 3 years, and they put this war down. How many of you have ever heard of this war? The third, the Kittos War. It's not very well known because obviously there's a much bigger rebellion that comes just 20 years later. So they put this rebellion down, and things do not get better for the Jews in these areas. There's still repression, and it comes to a major moment, and this is only recent knowledge, that Hadrian, the great Hadrian himself, comes into what we call Israel today, to the city of Jerusalem, where Jews were generally not allowed to be anyway, and decides that he's going to change the name of the city itself and build another city on top of Jerusalem. It's going to be called Aelia Capitolina. And in 130, he's going to do this. What is interesting is this is new research. Until fairly recently, the thought was that Hadrian built this city and changed the name of Jerusalem after the war. But recent studies have found out, no, he did it before, and it was one of the causes of the war. So that, of course, changes the cause of the war, but it doesn't change the reality of the situation. So Hadrian had already come in, decides he wants to change the name, probably because of the Kittos Rebellion. And this is one of the reasons we have this major rebellion by Bar Kokhba. Now, who is Bar Kokhba? How many of you have heard of this rebellion? This is the biggest rebellion of all. This is the one that we unfortunately do the best. Again, in war, coming in second place is not really good. And this is what happened. So Bar Kokhba is the major rebellion that starts in 132 and finishes in 136. So if we count it, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, almost 5 years of war. That is a lot of war for Rome, because is this a major war like the one they had against the Greeks? Is this a major war against the Parthians or Sassanids or major empires? This is not. This is a war against a small little nothing province in the middle of nowhere that they don't want to spend time dealing with. It's a troublesome little province, but it's not a big deal, and then it becomes a major deal. And this is why everything really goes wrong. So who is this Bar Kokhba character? Bar Kokhba is not actually his name, but of course that's what he is called. His name was Simeon ben Koseba or Kosiba. And he became Bar Kokhba because he's given this name later by, some believe, none other than Rabbi Akiva himself. It means son of the star. Bar like bar mitzvah, Kokhba like star. It's Aramaic. So Rabbi Akiva himself, the greatest rabbi of the age, declares this man the Messiah. This is why Bar Kokhba is not looked upon very generally, very positively in the Talmud, because he's named the Messiah, and obviously he wasn't, and so the Talmud, of course, is not real appreciative of that. So he is basically a gentleman who makes himself Nasi, head of the kind of like king or prince of the Jews, and he does take back the area for the Jews for the first time and last time for a long time. So basically what we see is a man who comes from, regular background, and he's able to free the country from the Romans for about 3 years. And we're going to look at how he does it and what goes wrong. Well, I think we can obviously figure out what goes wrong. They lose a much bigger force, but we'll see what happens and what leads up to it. So after these two wars and after the change in the city of Jerusalem to the new name, he comes out, his name is changed, has support from Akiva, and starts a rebellion against Rome, where it is estimated, and this could be just propaganda, that 580,000 Jews were killed. 580,000. Is that a true number? We don't know. It's because, of course, a Roman historian. Almost 1,000 villages completely destroyed. They ended up practicing what they call now scorched earth, which, of course, how did they win? They kept kind of like Russia during World War II. They burn everything as they go along, except Russia did it to protect themselves. Rome just goes forward, burns everything behind them, and keeps doing that the entire time, and that's how they win. Some would call it even almost genocide. The population is obviously devastated. Eventually, the strength of the Jewish world is going to move to where the Parthians are when we're invited over there. And so what we see is what he hoped to do was free the country, what he did for 3 years, but what he ended up doing was creating havoc. Jews are not going to be allowed to go into Jerusalem, and that is going to be a very long edict. There's going to be people who are going to be killed just because they're there. And it is a decimating time for the Jewish world. So what happens exactly to what goes on? First, this is not a rebellion that just happens. Previously in, for instance, both of the previous wars.
Speak up and get his attention.
Oh, does somebody have a question? Flossie.
I have one or two questions.
Please ask.
All right. What weapons were used at the time?
Spears, some bows and arrows. They're obviously using, iron now. There's obviously at times boats, but what you would think, catapults, rocks are thrown, swords, those are what they're using.
Is this the time after Judah Maccabee or before?
This is way after. So think of Judah Maccabee as 165 BCE. This is 132 CE.
Okay.
So you're talking about...
Didn't Judah Maccabee introduce guerrilla warfare?
He did, and that is exactly what they're going to do as well for a long time. 100% right. Larry.
You had mentioned Roman historians. I was just interested in what are the sources here? Now, with the Maccabees, we have some history, and there's the Book of the Maccabees and things of that nature. Is there a so-called Book of Bar Kokhba, or is there anything that, aside from
we actually have letters they found from Bar Kokhba himself. There is a historian named Cassius Dio, who is the main historian for this, who kept the records of what went on, whether it's true or not. But when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found a cave there, which they call the Cave of Letters, I believe, and they found information about the Bar Kokhba rebellion, including letters from possibly Bar Kokhba himself. They're at the Jewish Museum right now in Israel. So if you go there, I believe some of them are actually displayed. So we don't know how true this is, but you have to understand there is, as opposed, the more recent you go, the more archaeological evidence there is, and there is a ton of archaeological evidence about Bar Kokhba. He's minting coins. He's building caves all over the place, caves under cities. They found them all over. They find weapons. They found the coins, which obviously is the most obvious. They found letters. So there is quite a bit of art. This is not like Masada, which people thought was a rumor until they found when they actually, Yigal Yadin excavated. This was like a well-known enterprise. There's a lot of there's records, and there's a lot of archaeological evidence.
Was the revolt started in Jerusalem, or did it spread to Jerusalem?
It spread to Jerusalem. It didn't start there, obviously. So let's go over a little bit at the war, what happened. So first of all, the two previous wars, you have to understand, were happenstance. So the first war, all of a sudden, one sect of Jews want to revolt against the Romans. There's different sects, and not all of them want to revolt. And when they revolt, they don't all work together. The second one was happenstance as well. The major Roman force is fighting the Parthians. A lot of the garrisons have been emptied to go there, and the Jews take the opportunity to rebel. But it's not a unified front. This is a unified front where they prepare and they have estimations of what they need to do, and they know they have to cut off certain garrisons like the one in Jerusalem. So they go from garrison to garrison, cutting them off, going after garrisons that are smaller, that are not expected. They have up to 400,000 men at one time. So Bar Kokhba had a huge army compared to like the Roman troops were about 80,000.
Oh my goodness.
So who were not expecting it. So they overwhelm them at first. So they don't actually practice guerrilla warfare at the beginning because they're just attacking and surprising them with larger numbers. Then they create these hideout systems where once the numbers are not in their favor, they can go into caves, they go into the mountains, and then they attack more guerrilla style. And that works for a long time as well. And so what we see is Bar Kokhba is able to cut off, and I'm not a military guy, but he cuts off supply lines. And that really helps them maintain their advantage for a long time. The underground attacks, the caves are connected so they can go from one place to another. There are villages all around that are supporting them and hiding them. And so they are winning. Remember, the Roman soldiers are cut off from each other, so you have individual garrisons being attacked as opposed to all of them uniting. And so that's why they're able to spend so many years and actually be what they would consider themselves a free country for up to 3 years. So, it looks like everything's going well. You can understand why people think he's the Messiah, because they're beating the Romans in a way that very few places have been able to beat them, and those who have are usually much bigger and powerful. And so what turns out to be a small rebellion that the Romans don't think much of turns into a big rebellion. And, they've got access to water, they've got access to food, they've got access to cave, they have access to weapons because they've been preparing for this. And during this time, he is lionized very much like Shabtai Zvi was. Although in this case it's different because Shabtai Zvi was more spiritual. This is completely military. And we also have to remember, if you think of Jews today, and not counting the, of course, modern state of Israel, would you say that Jews are generally considered warriors or more educated, or what would you say, more, not educators, would you consider us warriors, or what's another word for smart people?
Academics.
Academics, thank you. What would you consider Jews throughout the last 2,000 years? Academics or soldiers? The answer is obviously academics. Why have Jews been considered academics for the last 2,000 years? Because of the Bar Kokhba War.
I would consider after the Yom Kippur War, though, that things really have changed.
And it is in
If
America.
you
Yeah,
spoke-
it
if you
is,
spoke to most people, their perception of Jews now would be, not academics, possibly, second,
yes.
but certainly military.
But for a very long time, we became more academics. We came to study and be spiritual. Yes, Flossie.
I didn't want to cut you off.
No, please cut me off. I don't.
We see Israel today when they are fighting, women are brought in to help fight. Were women used then, or they were behind the scenes helping?
That's a good question. I do not know if women. I assume women were helping, certainly hiding. Were they
I
doing
mean,
the
they
fighting?
weren't fighters or
That
anything.
I don't know. They probably were some, I would imagine, but I don't know. I'll have to check that. That's a very good question.
Well, Deborah, wasn't she, in addition to being a judge, wasn't she a warrior as
Yeah,
well? And there is some history of the preceding this, obviously, but of women involved.
Oh yeah, I mean, she is the most famous. But I don't know if women fought with. I have to look that up. I mean, I can look that up right now because that I don't remember. That's a good question. Let's see here if I can find anything. I'll have to look that up later. I don't know.
You can get
How did
back.
they finally put down the rebellion?
Well, what happened was they brought in troops from other places. They basically brought in 10 units from all over, from different places, from Europe, from Mesopotamia, and they brought them in.
And was he eventually captured, Bar Kokhba?
He was killed. Basically, the Bar Kokhba revolution ends with everybody being killed. You just assume everybody was killed. And because how they won was, as I mentioned, the scorched earth policy. They went from city to city and just destroyed everything and killed everything. They brought troops from what is Britain, from the Danube. They brought them from, I think, Arabia. And they brought in, I think, 10 legions. And
Was there a widespread belief, though, that he was the Messiah?
Oh, yeah.
A couple
Oh,
of
yeah.
rabbis actually promoted that, but
there were many did, not all. A lot did not. But Akiba was the most famous rabbi of all.
How
So
long did that last?
the rebellion lasted 5 years.
No,
So
but I mean,
also
as far as his belief, the belief that he was the Messiah, because it's
not very long after he died.
yeah.
Remember, the country was decimated. I mean, they brought in 10 legions. They brought 120,000 soldiers just for battles. I mean, they're literally coming in and going step by step and just destroying everything as they go. And it cost a lot of money, and it cost a lot of time and effort. And there were a lot of other things going on they probably could have done. And so as time went on, Bar Kokhba loses more and more territory. The Roman army goes to individual fortresses and villages and just destroys them step by step. And then basically Bar Kokhba ends up holed up in a place called Betar, which is a fortress, which you may have heard of because it is a very, where do you hear Betar, B-E-T-A-R? It's a Zionist youth movement.
Oh.
That's the name chosen by Young Zionists. Young Judea may be a little bit more well known in America, but outside America, Canada and all over Europe and Russia, Betar was the name of the youth movement for Zionists. So that's because that's the last stronghold where Bar Kokhba. So I think Bar Kokhba died during the siege. I don't think they captured him. Flossie.
Where did the concept of the Mashiach, the Messiah, come from in Judaism?
Well, there's allusions to it in Isaiah. I mean, there's reference, Cyrus would be the first, but really the Messiah became a popular figure in the Jewish world around the year 0. When the Romans had been in charge now for 40 years, things are looking bad. The Romans are really powerful, so the belief that you could take down the Romans was less so than probably other places. And so that's when that belief, but again, there's references sort of in Isaiah, but it really is not a center of the Bible as we know it. But Bar Kokhba is probably the first major Jewish person who's considered like messianic and that people believe is the Messiah, because he's, he does so well. I mean, he killed, you're there, you kill all the Romans, the garrison is decimated, the Romans are fleeing, you're in charge of your country. Of course, you tend to forget that there's a Roman Empire out there that does not like losing, even to small countries. It sets a bad precedent.
Moses was never actually even hinted at as being the Messiah, for example.
No, I mean, the word Messiah means, it's not really what we're, the Messiah is a different character. What Moses was.
Because that was prior to actually the Bible, which would have been even prior to the prophets, I guess, right? It's the prophets that kind of brought along the concept, as you say, Isaiah.
Well, you see the word a lot because the word Messiah in Hebrew just means anoint, or anointed for the Messiah. So how you look at the Messiah and what it is debated throughout history. But the messianic character, as we know it, is usually someone who comes about during times of great turmoil, someone who will save us from that turmoil.
Yeah, it's not unique to Judaism, obviously. There are ideas of the Messiah. For example, King Arthur was thought to be a Messiah kind of figure in England. And even in World War II, his name was kind of used as like the savior that would come along and, protect England from the Nazis in World War II. There are other figures in history that other nations have had. So, like someone's going to come along and save us.
Yeah, and again, the more trouble this idea causes the powers that be, the more problems it'll be. Shabtai Zvi, it didn't cause a lot of problems in terms of mass deaths. We'd already had the Chmielnicki rebellion where hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed. Shabtai Zvi talked about was the Messiah. That was more of a spiritual thing. Once he converts to Islam, people just are really depressed and disappointed. But he did not lead to mass destruction of the Jewish world. That was already going on. The Bar Kokhba does. So when Bar Kokhba dies, he dies before, I believe, Beitar is captured. But the leaders and the rabbis who supported them are captured and tortured publicly and killed publicly, and in truly vicious ways, including Rabbi Akiva, who was tortured and then I think burned at the stake. So it was a devastating one. There were Jews sold into slavery.
Wow.
Along with Again, I'll mention almost 1,000 villages, almost 600,000 people. Is that correct? We don't know. That's just the historical record by the Cassius Dio, the Roman historian. Some Jewish communities survived because they may not have been supported. There were Jewish communities in the Galilee that did survive. This is why the Galilee will become so important, places eventually like Sfat, because that was not decimated. Places like Caesarea, which are Beit Shean, which we go to when we visit, those were not destroyed because they didn't support so there were certain places where the Jews were able to go afterwards, but by and large, the Jewish community is going to start their exodus from Israel, and over the next 150 years, the leadership of Israel is going to move to mostly Iraq and Iran. This is before the Muslims. You got the Parthians who invite them, then the Sassanids who invite them, and this is where they're going to start up great academies in this area. But Rome suffered incredible losses as well. I mean, Christians were killed. Anybody who was thought to be connected, even if you weren't, were killed. And this really created havoc between Christian and Jewish relations as well, because most of the Jewish Christians were not supporting it because they already had their Messiah, but some of them were killed because of it. The final great moment in our history in Israel will be the writing of the Mishnah, which will be finished there. And then, of course, there will be a Talmud written in Israel. It's called the Jerusalem Talmud, but the main Talmud is, of course, called the Babylonian Talmud because it's written in what is Babylon. So the scholarship will leave, the country will be decimated. Jews will not be allowed to go into Jerusalem except for on Tisha B'Av. It's a different place now. Eventually, of course, these Jews will be some will be conscripted into the military. Others will be sent out as slaves, the ones who survive. It is a decimation. And then afterwards, things do not get better for Jews in the area because there becomes a lot more prohibitions on religion. Hadrian prohibits the reading of Torah. They have to stop using the Jewish calendar. Scholars are killed. Statues of Roman gods are put in Jewish cities everywhere. They even start changing the names of places so that they try and so that the idea of this Jewish country never existed. So really it is an assault on the Jewish world, and this is not because Constantine converts to Christianity, because that's not for hundreds of years. So it is, an effect to this day. And so we have different views of Bar Kokhba. Some look at him, like in Israel, as an incredible patriot who freed the Jews and was willing to take on the most powerful army in the world. And so he is venerated in Israel. The coins are especially considered valuable. They mint new coins of Bar Kokhba every once in a while. So that's great. But on the other hand, it was a very depressing end to a promising rebellion. Larry.
One sort of interesting sidelight that I just found out, I was doing a talk for the Temple Oseh Shalom Brotherhood on the Nazi Olympics, which was 1936, which is the Jesse Owens Olympics. And then there was the controversy with Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller, the two runners. But I went back a little bit in history there, and you find out that the Jews actually got the first athletic clubs were actually started in Germany in the 1870s, 1880s, kind of as offshoots of colleges and schools of things like this to promote things like fencing and horsemanship and things like this. And at the time, even Jews were excluded, not that they wanted to participate too much in those clubs, but, they were excluded anyway. So then around the 1890s, the Jews started one of their first clubs, their first athletic clubs. And then when the Jews were even in Palestine or, pre-Israel, they had many athletic clubs at the time that were started. And the two major groups of clubs were called the Bar Kokhba Club and the Maccabiah Club. And the Maccabiah Club kind of overwhelmed in numbers and in participation what the Bar Kokhba Club was. The Maccabiah Club in 1932, which is prior, obviously, to the State of Israel forming, the first Maccabiah Games were held, which surprised me that the British Authority, the Mandate Palestine Authority, gave them permission to hold the Maccabiah Games, and they called it the Maccabiah Games rather than the Bar Kokhba Games. Right. So, his name was well known, apparently, during that time, but Maccabiah kind of won out as kind of the symbol for, and I think even today with Hanukkah, taking more precedence, we certainly in the United States know him better. It's kind of an interesting sidelight.
Yeah, I mean, again, and there's a lot of ironies with what happened as well. I mean, Hadrian becomes emperor in 118, and he's actually very pro-Jewish in the beginning. I mean, he tells the
Was he actually Jewish, Hadrian?
No, he was not
No,
Jewish.
who was the one that built the second temple?
That was Herod.
Herod. Okay, Herod. I'm sorry. Yeah,
Herod was Jewish, but he is Idumean, which means he is descended from a group of people who were forcibly converted. So he was not
Oh,
necessarily looked upon as Jewish, but he was Jewish. But Hadrian, who we think about when we come to the war, was actually pro-Jewish. He's kind of, he comes to Israel, he says he's going to rebuild the temple, and then decides not to. Then he seems supportive. Then he says, I'm going to change the name of the city and name it after me. So, they're already have these minor attacks in that area when he appoints a guy named Rufus, who was a tyrant, who was a harsh ruler who just made things worse. And once Hadrian leaves after beginning the city, that's, they start this rebellion against a guy who they thought was going to be very Jewish and let them do a lot of things. And instead, he ended up being very harsh. And of course, once the Jews are doing really well, that's when the Romans start sending in large number of legions. They start sending in their best generals. They start saying all bets are off. And that's what happened. So it could have gone a different way, but it didn't.
Rabbi,
Yes.
how do we feel about the Messiah today?
Well, the Messiah today is a very interesting debate. There are those who feel very strongly that the Messiah is going to come. The Messiah, by the way, is traditionally not somebody with powers. It used to be the vision of the Messiah could be militarily, because it's a descendant of King David. We've kind of changed that view and view it more as an ethereal type of messianism, that the world's going to be at peace and the Messiah will come and put the stamp on it. Some believe there's a Messiah born every generation, that if it actually works out, that person will be, the Messiah. But so far it hasn't happened. Others, I'm sorry, Flossie.
No, I'm sorry. I was going to.
No, after your question, please.
Did people feel during the Holocaust? I mean, that would be a very rough time for the Jews, that someone could have stepped forward.
Yeah, I think the Holocaust, a lot of people were waiting, hoping for the Messiah. And not ironically, but I mean, obviously, after the Holocaust, a lot of people who believed in the Messiah stopped believing in the Messiah. So, but today, a lot of us don't necessarily believe in Messiah as an individual. Some believe that we can work together to make the world a better place. But that's the basis of a lot of the Reform movement. The idea, that's one of the bases for the Reform movement, is we're not waiting for the Messiah to fix the world. We've got to do it ourselves.
You had mentioned Schneerson briefly. Now, was between Bar Kokhba and Schneerson, were there other people that rabbis or had been promoted or as Messiah figures?
There's been a lot of them through the ages. I mean, too many to name. It happens all the time in some periods, but whether they become prominent enough to become considered a true messianic person, what you need support, you need leadership, you need money, you need people to write about you, you need to have scholars naming you the Messiah. So it doesn't happen very often that there are people who get to this level where people, all over the world are calling them Messiah. Schneerson's the most recent. Before that, you got, guys like Napoleon, you got Shabtai Zvi, Bar Kokhba, Cyrus, Alexander. There's just not that many who become really famous for it.
Now, Schneerson's father-in-law, right, was the leader of the Chabad movement.
Was it his father-in-law? I thought it was his father, but I could be wrong.
I thought it was his father-in-law or something, but he was never really designated as the Messiah, I don't think, right? So Schneerson was...
In that world, he is considered the Messiah. So Schneerson, who died about 28 years ago, who brought his community from
Eastern Europe. Yeah.
From Eastern Europe, from the place called Lubavitch. I think that was
never went
city.
back. Yeah.
He brought his whole community, and and he is in that world considered the Messiah.
But his father-in-law or father, whatever it was, or his predecessor, I guess, of the leader of that movement was never really considered.
I don't know. Menachem Mendel Schneerson is who his father was. Who was? I don't think. I mean, his father was like a head rabbi person, and his father was it his father who brought the people over here. I think it was Schneerson and his father who brought the community here. But I don't know if his father was considered the Messiah. Also, I don't think so.
In fact, in Schneerson's grave, they still have the Jews watching over his grave 24/7, waiting for him to come back.
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, he took over during the 30s when, the Nazis were coming to rise, and he got them out, right?
Rabbi, can I switch gears for a moment? Sure. I know they've had a recent election in Israel. Have you heard anything?
I have not paid attention. Last I heard, it looked like it was going to be Netanyahu. Did anybody check today? That's a good question.
No, I didn't check today.
They were waiting to see if the Arab parties were gonna, but it looks like he's gonna win. Still, that's last.
Will he have enough votes to form a government, or?
Yeah, they thought he was going to get up to 61 or 62.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Which, if you're a fan of his, it's good news. If you're not a fan of his, it's bad news. So he's going to set to win. It looks like 65 seats. So.
Really? Oh, okay.
Oh, it's a big thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so he's already then.
Yeah.
Did he pull in any of the Arab parties? I don't think would have gone with him, right?
You never know what's going to happen these days. Doubtfully, but you never know. But I think all the really, the really right-wing religious parties all support him, and so he's going to get all of that vote. So, but we'll see.
Rabbi, don't we, going back to the Mashiach, don't we during the Seder open the door that the Mashiach can come in?
We do. Well, we open it for Elijah.
Yeah.
Elijah is the person who's going to precede the Messiah.
So he will precede then.
Right. He's kind of like the guy's going to come out and say, "Hey, the Messiah's here."
Yeah. Oh, that will be Elijah's job. Is that it?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So it looks like he's going to win. It's going to be a very right-wing government. And so...
Rabbi, one time, can we maybe have a class on how Jews see God?
Sure. We can do that whenever we want.
We sort of had that book, The Many Faces of God.
Yeah, we did that for a while, but I'm happy to do it again.
Yeah, that was interesting. We went through probably 10 different visions of, God, different, whether he's a person, whether he's a thought, whether he's,
a spirit.
Yeah, spirit. But that book was very good at the time. We could refresh our memory on that book.
I'm happy to do it again.
Went through it hurriedly, yeah.
Larry, did you hear the rumor? He's here in Sun City walking around.
Well, the next class we'll do Schneerson next week.
Oh, good.
Okay.
And then we do have 2 weeks we don't have class, the 16th, because I'm teaching in Bluffton that day for Hadassah. And then the 23rd, obviously, Thanksgiving week. Then on the 30th, we're going to do the Lunch and Learn, talk about the non-Jewish messiahs. And then we're going to go lunch at the Mexican restaurant.
Right, that's at the library now.
Right.
At 2 o'clock, at 10 o'clock, I believe, or 10:15, something like that.
Is it 10:15 instead of 10:30?
10:15, 10:30, yeah. I mean, we'll come a little bit early. The library opens at 10.
So we'll still say 10:30 to get everybody. I'll be there early.
Sure. And I
We
gave
don't
you
have
the name of the Mexican restaurant, right, Rabbi?
You did not. Just said Mexican restaurant. What's the name of it?
I thought I did send you a,
Maybe send it. I didn't
see
see
if there's another email there. I don't have it with me right now.
Let me check.
Something fresh.
Fiesta Fresh.
Fiesta Fresh or something.
Fiesta Fresh. Okay. Yep, Fiesta Fresh. Got it now. I see this.
Okay, and I gave you the address and all of that information.
All right. And thanks for taking us all out. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I hope we get some attendance there. That would be
Yeah.
nice.
We'll have a couple people for sure. And we'll get, basically, I moved to Georgia just so I could have Mexican food in South Carolina. That's why I came here all the way from Texas. That was the reason.
It's not a fancy place, though.
To answer your question, Larry, you
Yeah.
got at least 6 people coming.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
Well,
good.
with Michael, it'll be 7.
Yeah. No, I'm hoping I mentioned it to Karen Blickstein also, so maybe we'll get some Oseh Shalom people.
Yeah.
And we'll probably get some other people who don't want to come
Well,
online and do it. We got
And there might be people who would want to come, yeah. So
When it's in the 20th, you're
the
talking.
20th, this is the 30th,
the 30th.
30th, November 30th.
Rabbi,
16th, hopefully we'll get people also, because
Yeah, the 16th
that's
is
on
the
anti-Semitism.
that's the anti-Semitism. That's
Right.
Hadassah and Oseh Shalom.
Yeah, so I'm not
at
going
the
to teach that day. Because I'm already going to be there for, Hadassah.
Right.
Rabbi, do Jews believe in the supernatural?
Yes, some do. Again, the supernatural, and I just did a class on this, has been a part of Judaism. Obviously, the belief in the supernatural rises and falls depending on the culture you're living in. If you're living in an educated, modern, scientifically based society, belief in the supernatural is going to be lower. And if you're in a repressed, uneducated area, it's going to be higher. But obviously, we do believe in the supernatural. Just think of the things we all do. We put red ribbons. We crush the. There's a lot of beliefs, things we do that are based on this. Everything from stepping on the glass to saying poo poo, to not avoiding to having a chamsa, or some saving the mezuzahs for that. So.
Did they say poo poo in Texas?
No, in Texas we just spit. The poo poo is for people who don't want to spit in front of others, because you usually would spit, but instead of spitting, you say, I don't want to spit here, I do poo poo.
Would the golem be considered any kind of a
Golem.
Oh, and I just did this whole class. The golem would definitely be the
messianic figure? Would he be considered?
No,
a
he's
messianic
definitely he is
figure?
not the messianic figure at all. The
No.
messianic figure usually is thought to come from the line of David, but doesn't have to. But it's usually a human being. He is, you think of the Frankenstein and you kind of hit on the head with the golem is created. Usually there's a lot of golem stories. The main one, of course, the most famous one is the Golem of Prague, which is a very recent one comparatively. But golem is basically, it's a story about how we should not try and be like God. You're creating out of dust or clay a being, which is against the rules. Even if you're creating it to protect yourself, it eventually runs amok and you got to stop it after it's done damage. That's the story of, there's several stories.
Oh, he wasn't looked at as though a savior kind of.
He is
figure
looked at
that
as
came
savior,
at the
but more
time
like
of-
a protector, more of like.
It's a protector, but he gets berserk.
There's always
He out of
something that
control.
goes wrong. In every story, something goes wrong. In some stories, he looks like a human being. He passes for a human being,
Hmm.
And in some stories, he looks like a kind of like a blob monster. This is the most famous one. This is, this is if you go to Prague, you'll see this vision of the golem all over the place.
What does golem mean, Rabbi?
I just forgot the name golem means. It means golem. Oh, I just forgot. Let me look it up. Sorry. What? I forgot the. I can't remember what the name is. It is. What's the? I gotta look for the heat. My goodness, I'm just forgetting it. It's like golem means like light.
Light?
or raw. I think something like raw. It's like it's,
What does it mean?
Like light.
yeah, light form, like a form light or raw material, something like that. It's from the word.
Light or light?
So you're saying the main idea was that this is a prohibition against imitating God to create
Right.
something out of clay rather than as a savior kind of figure or a savior figure who might go, even if he did it, it goes wrong
Right.
as the only creator. I see.
Yeah. So, and this is the story we see. Again, there's so many stories about, I mean, there's a lot of them. The one in Prague is the most famous because it's, written by a famous rabbi. So, but there's others. It's basically an anthropomorphic being made out of clay or dirt that is created to protect Jews. That's all it is. And it's done in places where Jews are powerless. And, it's the forerunner of Golem, obviously, from Lord of the Rings, the forerunner of Frankenstein and Young Frankenstein. So, and again, there's several of them. The one by the Maharal is the most famous, but there's others as well. And if you go, there's lots of stories and books written about them.
When was the Golem written, actually? About what time?
Well, there's not one story. There's a bunch
The
of
Prague
stories.
one, for example.
Yeah, I mean, he's mentioned in the Talmud.
Oh, it is.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Not necessarily specific stories. There's a book called the Book of Creation, Sefer Yetzirah, during the Middle Ages, which teaches you how to make one.
Hmm.
Okay, so you
You do
have.
that at the library. We'll all make one.
I mean, you have stories about the golem from the 11th century, the 12th, 13th.
Oh,
Obviously,
okay, yeah,
the 16th is the most famous, but also the 17th, very famous, of course, and the 20th and the 19th century even. So, it's in what was the novel that won the Pulitzer? That had the golem in there. I forgot the name of the book, but it was the one with about the.
Oh, they're in Iceland or someplace. They're
No,
in the frozen.
it's about comic book writers.
Yeah.
And then they take the story. They take the golem out of the place where it was for safety. So, again, the legends. We could talk about this. I just did a whole thing on witchcraft and
The Strange Adventures of Cassenberry and
Yes,
something like that,
yeah,
right?
The
It was
Adventures of Cavalier and Clay.
Cavalier and Clay, right.
That's right.
Cavalier and Clay, yeah, that was a great book. Yeah.
And of course, they have the famous one from the Golem of Prague in the 19th century. So if you go to, Prague, you can go into the synagogue, and he was supposed to be in the attic.
That's right. That's where he took the woman.
Yeah, and also, I mean, at some points he looked like a human being, and so he could pass. And some points, often you had to put some sort of parchment in his mouth. It could be, a Torah scroll, or you would put a word on his, write a word on him. The most famous one we talk about is this word. The word is emet for truth.
Oh.
And then if you take off this letter, he would stop working because that is now death.
Really?
Yeah, so that's the most famous one.
Death.
So basically what you do is you have Emet, and then it comes Shabbos, and you don't want him breaking Shabbos because he doesn't understand the rules. So you just take off the Aleph and he's dead. And then after Shabbos is over, you put it back on and he lives again. So
Yeah, we ate in his restaurant in Prague.
Oh yeah, he's a terrific chef though. The Golem was always known as a terrific chef.
Let me shut the.
Well, well, all right. So sorry again we started late, but absolute pleasure. Next we're going to talk, I guess we'll talk about Schneerson,
Coming over.
and any questions you have, let me know. And look forward to seeing you guys at the end of November.
Yeah, there's a
Rabbi,
good,
can I just ask Jane a question?
Sure, please.
Jane, are you coming over to make the matzo balls? Jane?
No, I don't.
I answered you yes,
All
Oh,
right.
okay. All right.
12:30.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Rabbi.
No, please make more matzo balls. That's great. It's for the food festival, I assume, since
Yes,
Passover is not till April.
Ollie
make
is having,
more matzo balls.
I'm going to a class on Ollie this afternoon about the next spaceship, so to speak, that's going to the moon.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's the, I forget what it's called, Artemis, I think it is, the Artemis. So they're having a former NASA employee that's going to
Oh,
be
nice.
talking. If it was Zoom, you could sit in on it, but it's
I
only
would-
live.
I
So I'm
would
going
love
to
to
go
do
over
that.
there and hear what the mission is all about.
Nice. That would
Apparently,
be
it's a
fun.
large enough space system to, to travel to the moon and back and resupply a lot of the satellites in there as well.
And it's a shield.
Are they going to send people one of these days again, or we just?
That's the purpose, is for the
Oh,
next manned mission to the moon. Yeah, Artemis
wow.
will be the next
Okay.
manned
That's
mission to
awesome.
the moon.
Good.
All right.
Uh,
Good to know. Well, have fun, guys. That sounds awesome. I would love to hear
Oh,
that.
yeah, I do know that.
All right, guys. So I'll see you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
We have class next week, and then we don't have it the next couple weeks. So stay safe, everybody.
Okay,
All right,
bye-bye.
everybody, take care of yourself.